don't get along very well. Am I on? Here we go. Okay. How you doing? I liked Eli Kahn, who was here a couple weeks ago, a musician. His latest album is called How Are You Doing? No, really, how are you doing? And I feel like I should probably follow up any question like that with a really, how are you doing? We're just coming out of the beginning of the holiday season. Saw online, somebody said to put Christmas and Thanksgiving so close to each other, that is way too much time, too little time in between seeing family members. You need more time to spread out the trauma. I hope that you've been finding peace and resilience in this season. We've been talking, as Beth said, a lot about things that the world needs now. And we're framing it in what the world needs, but I want to think about what we need specifically. Because, yeah, we can get into big talks about the state of politics and state of democracy in the United States and what the next 4 years look like. But I'm most interested in what is going to emerge out of this season. Last time I was up here, we talked about upeka, this Pali word for equanimity, which means this non-judgmental observation. To see something, to observe it, and to resist the desire to label that as inherently good or bad. That's tough. Because anybody who's ever done any kind of mindfulness practice, if you pay attention to your thinking mind, what is it doing? It's constantly, I wish this person would be quieter. Why are they so close to me? I wish it was colder in here. I'm too hot right now. Our mind is never satisfied, and we're always labeling, always critiquing. Equanimity is this process of coming into a balance, a homeostasis. As Ram Dass says, it's learning to keep your heart open while walking through hell. When going through the most difficult things in our life, equanimity, this upeka, this ideal allows us to, or invites us to not be so strongly attached to the things in our life that we call happenings to us, but to allow them to pass through, to feel the feelings, and to move on. It's a balanced form of a compassionate neutrality. It's a calm state of mind that isn't affected by, or that isn't indifferent, but it's free from extremes of attachment and aversion. Today I want to talk about, though, this idea of adaptation, of evolution. I put the R in parentheses in the front because, I couldn't help but play with the word. I thought about the Beatles' White Album and that idea of, you say you want a revolution, yeah, we know we all can change the world. That kind of justice march idea, it goes with the feeling of what I think of when I think of evolution. Because right now, I'm torn between this idea of evolving and growing and this idea, as Beth said, of just burning it all down. And that's fair because right now there's a lot of big feelings in the world. Anybody who's shared Thanksgiving recently with family knows that that's probably the case, right? Maybe you may have preempted that by putting some healthy ground rules in place. And if that's the case, I commend you for that. We need to watch out and guard our hearts right now. But I want to talk about this idea of evolution, adaptation, developing a resilience. Because evolution is more than just a biological process, even though I'm so fascinated with it. Maybe this is because I grew up in a Christian homeschool environment and I was not taught evolution as any type of practical science, but as something to laugh at. Anybody who's heard Ken Ham or is familiar with that, or the Noah's Ark project and stuff. I mean, I saw all those guys speak as a kid. I grew up learning about creationism, but it has only been in my discovery as an adult of evolution that I've come into such a fascination and an appreciation for this process that takes place in our planet and has been taking place over millions of years. It's phenomenal. Charles Darwin talks about evolution, and we think of it as survival of the what? Right. That's commonly what most people think of. But it's actually this adaptation. In a recap of Darwin's Origin of the Species, Megison says it's not the most intellectual species that survived, nor the strongest, but the species that is best able to adapt and to adjust to changing environments in which it finds itself. Evolution is more than just a biological process. It's a narrative of resilience, creativity, and adaptation in the face of change. About 120 million years ago, life on this planet looked very, very different than it did today. For one thing, we weren't around and affecting the planet in the way that we were. But some marine invertebrates had wandered up onto land, but then found that land life was a little bit harsh and that all the food was in the water. And so they began this journey back into the oceans that they emerged from. One of those limbs on the evolutionary family tree is the sea turtle. And the sea turtle is such a fascinating adaptation of evolution. Because sea turtles and any marine vertebrates with this terrestrial ancestry going back into the ocean faces this problem, which is that its blood salinity needed to stay where it did to survive, but all the food it was eating and the water it was drinking and everything it was consuming was so high in salt that it would need to excrete far more of that to be able to balance out. And its livers at the time just couldn't do that. And evolution always comes up with fascinating adaptations. Drinking seawater raises the salinity of the body, as we know. If we're out on a ship at sea and if we're stranded, as tempting as it is to drink that seawater, that would kill us quicker than anything because our body can't process that salt. And the sea turtles are exactly the same way. Leatherback sea turtles, they're highly migratory. They travel 10,000 miles in their lifetime. They can travel up to 4,000 feet in depth in the ocean. But one of their most fascinating traits is the development of these specialized glands by its eyes. And it's come to take on the persona of crying if you see it on land. But it's not actually a tear duct. It's a specialized gland that's actually larger than its brain that allows the sea turtle to eat and to drink the seawater, raising its blood salinity, and then through these glands to expel the salt water from its body. If you ever see a sea turtle on land, you'll see constantly the stream of salt coming from its eyes. But when it's in the ocean, it's constantly expelling the salt from its body. The sea turtles learned to adapt in an environment that wasn't suited for the life that they were living. And as we see throughout evolution, every great evolutionary adaptation always began with some kind of a threat, something that caused that species, that plant, to force itself into finding an adaptation. Some of those adaptations are fascinating. We see creatures today with all sorts of crazy things, from the duck-billed platypus to the armadillos to the long neck of the giraffe. Each of those adaptations being a response to something that a creature somewhere along the way faced a challenge. Viktor Frankl said, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves. And like the sea turtle, we have to ask ourselves how we can change and adapt. It's not about ignoring the challenges of the world that we live in, but it's about finding ways to process the world, just as the sea turtle processes the salt that it consumes. So in this case here, I read this from Richard Powers' latest book. Anybody read The Overstory? Fascinating novel. Anybody who wants to connect with trees in a deeper way, that's such a great novel for it. And Playground is Powers' newest novel. It does for the ocean kind of what it did for trees, what Overstory did for trees. And when I was, I think in the first quarter of the book is where this illustration, this little small side note of this unique adaptation of sea turtles came up. And as it does with so many different things, I had to stop and go down a rabbit hole, and I pull out my phone, and I'm learning about sea turtles, and I'm finding out all these fascinating things. This is an amazing adaptation. Probably a less interesting one or a little creepier one is to look at the throat of a sea turtle, because it has this strange spiny throat that looks very much like the sarlacc in Return of the Jedi, if you've the desert monster with all the okay. So it has this special kind of like these forked tongues that helps it swallow its food, and it faces kind of like a one direction, sort of like those reverse spikes that you see in parking lots. That's basically what it's looked like. It's all the way down. Fascinating adaptations. But this idea of a turtle living its whole life in an environment that could kill it, but instead adapting to the environment, caused me to think. Because we are living in a time, and it's so easy for us right now to have many responses to the world in which we live, all of which, to be honest, are valid at times, including ignoring it, including focusing on other things, laughing, humor. I've been watching, Lisa and I have been watching more funny movies. We've been reading more just nonsensical things and doing more fun things. Beth talked a little bit ago about play. That is still such a huge part of our adaptation, of our strategy moving forward. But what I'm thinking about and what I'm hopeful for in communities like ours are the adaptations that we develop moving forward in a world that is not suited for the way in which we move through it. When the values that we hold dear aren't reflected in the people that we elect, when turning on the news puts us into such a state of anxiety or panic, we're forced to have to ask ourselves, what are the things we need to do, first of all, for our own survival? And that is always, always important. So when we're thinking about this, if we're thinking about this salt water being something that the sea turtles live in, you could almost imagine that, much like the frog, where the temperature of the water has been turned up, we've been in a world that has been gradually, or very quickly, in some ways, changing right around us. And maybe it was an election for you. Maybe it was the last election. Maybe it was something else entirely. But somewhere along the line, you began to realize this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't the world that I want to live in right now. This doesn't feel tenable. How do I survive? And the very, very first thing that we have to do is acknowledging the salt. Pretending that the salt water is not there doesn't do a darn thing. We acknowledge the salt, and to acknowledge the toxic, stressful environment that we live in is the first step towards beginning to developing coping strategies. Acknowledging and recognizing that the world has changed and that the things that maybe we used to do, perhaps we have to do in a different way or not at all. I asked in our pre-talk, one of the questions was, how has your engagement or the way that you engage with news changed in the last month? Has it changed? And for many of you have shared with me, you've taken steps to intentionally reduce, turn off your news consumption for a while. I sometimes hear people talk about it almost with a little bit of guilt, as if it's removing yourself from the solution. But we all know that stepping away and guarding our hearts sometimes is necessary. But we have to name the challenge rather than ignoring it. We have to acknowledge the salt. And just as the sea turtle has to process salt, we have to process what is challenging us if we are going to move forward. Processing is essential. And it's about accepting life as it is, not as we wish it were. We sent the email out this past week about a little fun, tongue-in-cheek advice from Ram Dass about learning to see people as trees, rather than labeling them and wanting them to be one way or another, but to just see them as the result of who they are. Somebody emailed me back, and by the way, anybody who emails back on these emails there, I read them all, I love them. Somebody emailed back and said in that response there, may we all be Tom Bombadils and Ents. They knew how much I love Lord of the Rings. May we all help care for the trees of the world, be they stunted, gnarled, rotted, or threatening. All have emerged from seeds of the great divine. What a beautiful thought. But to acknowledge life as it is, that's that first step, acknowledging the salt. This is life right now. The life that we see when we turn on the news, when we talk to people all around us, and probably it's going to get a little bit hotter. The temperature is going to get turned up. We acknowledge the situation. We name the challenge so that we can process it. But then the next step is to transform that challenge, to find ways of turning that into not just getting by, but turning it into areas for growth and strength. Resilience often means rethinking our approach, like learning new skills, shifting perspectives, seeking support. I can tell you that in the last 4 weeks, between Lisa and I, we have tried and added just about all the things that you can add into your life without just completely filling it up, between additional therapy, yoga, breath work, mindfulness, you name it, we're pulling out all of the tricks out of our bag right now. And I would encourage you to do that too. Go back and find things in your life that have been serving for you at times when you've gone through that. Pull them back out now. Lean into some new modalities, new practices for you in this season. Because remember, it's not survival of the fittest. It is survival of the most adaptable. It is not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It's not the strongest. It is the most adaptable. You see, resilience is not just about enduring. It's about adapting to the changing world, to the changing things that we see all around us. And then finally, once we acknowledge the salt water that we're swimming in, once we acknowledge that things are as they are, regardless of whether we wish them to be otherwise or not, when we begin to transform that challenge through learning new skills, new coping strategies, by developing new practices, the part that I gain encouragement from is this. You see, the sea turtle doesn't swim through the oceans and the whole time swim through going, ow, ow, oh, this sucks. I hate this so much. I hate salt. It doesn't think twice about the salt water because it has already adapted and that salt water has become its home. I promise you that some of the most difficult things that you don't think you will be able to endure, that when you lean into that challenge, you will find a resilience that is far stronger than you realized. Friends of ours who have lost children, family members, gone through incredible losses. You ask any single one of them, and prior to them going through that, not a single one of them would have thought that they would have had the capability to make it through. And probably at various points along the way, they were quite positive they weren't going to make it. But by simply moving through, by adapting, by developing that resilience through sticking through the toughest of times, by developing and fostering that community of support, not only have they moved through it, but have found new opportunities that have emerged. One of my very good friends that we just got together with in the last week has gone through some tremendous losses in terms of fertility. Their fertility journey is just some of the most heartbreaking that I've heard personally. And I walked with them through that experience the best that I could, not offering any advice, but simply just trying to be there as much of a friend as I could. And it was painful watching my friend go through this situation, to see them go through loss after loss. And at a certain point, when you run out of things to say, you're like, what else can I offer? And to be honest, they may not have made it through that. But we just had lunch with them, and what's fascinating is they're leaning into this challenge, embracing it in a healthier way I've ever heard. They're leaning into marriage therapy together. They're growing closer to each other. And they were talking about this close friend who just lost a child, and a friend was wanting to put them in contact. And she, for the first time, said, I didn't think I could ever be in this point now, but I'm finally getting to the point where I can be healed enough that I think I can offer something to this person. That's what adaptation looks like. It means going through something so hard, so difficult that we think is going to bury us, only to emerge on the other side and to look around once the smoke is cleared and as the sun is starting to peek through, and to realize, oh, I survived. I made it. And that's my hope for us as communities, that we can begin to be the peace and to embody the peace in the world that we want to see. And we don't need anything from any governmental authority to allow us to do that. By simply being who we are and living in this world, by adapting and developing a resilience, we bring something to this world that it so desperately needs. Evolution takes time. I want to close with that quote. I think it's in the bulletin from Maya Angelou. That reminds us that you may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. There's a lot happening in the world, and in the scope of all the things that are happening, I want to first give you permission, if this is what you need, to adapt and develop whatever you need to get you through. If that means disengaging from news for a time, if that means spending some more time developing some new habits, if that means being on a talking break from that one person who drives you up a wall, do what you need to do. Acknowledge the situation. Acknowledge the salt water. But together, we're adapting. We're resilient. We're thriving. We're changing in a world that needs us so desperately to change. Thank you for sharing this time, this planet, this space with me this morning. Namaste.